Well, thank you again to everybody here for inviting me. It's really like a pleasure and an honor to be here and to have the possibility of sharing some of my work with you. So let me, since we don't have much time, I will go straight to the paper. Let me start with a little bit of context. I mean, for the last couple of years, I've been working in a research project which involves conducting ethnographies, rather short, around 2 months each, in the studios of visual artists, architects, and video game developers. And the aim of this project has been to provide a sort of different view of the so-called creative industries based on this ethnographic approach, focusing on how people actually engage in creative work instead of sort of looking at the institutional or social or sort of city context that might favor or hinder creativity, whatever that means, right? So shortly after starting this project, it became quite clear to me that I needed to actually get rid of this notion of creativity, as it kind of represents a major black box hindering a more empirical approach to, hindering a sort of more empirical approach to creative processes. And the problem with creativity is not just its association with a sort of romantic figure, my water, or this idea of the genius artist, or these kind of ideas with a sort of divine or mystic inspiration. Beyond this, the problem with creativity is that it's mostly understood in purely cognitive terms, as a sort of thought process leading to a novel idea. And I think there are two major problems with this definition. The first one is that creativity is reduced to a sort of non-observable mental activity. Creativity is something that is in the head of the individuals. So you know this, if you're a city, right, and what you want to do is to attract these individuals who are creative by themselves, so to speak, and form and have a creative class or something like that. So that's one problem. The second is the assumption that creativity leads to novelty, and this assumption actually only allows for ex post accounts. In the sense that it allows for a sort of backward reading of creativity. So whether a process, any process, will be creative or considered creative or not will depend on the future evaluation of its result as being novel or not being novel. So this is heavily problematic, and we know from innovation studies that whether something will be considered novel depends on a bunch of cultural evaluation processes which are different in different regions and in different times, and that they are also reversible. So it might be considered novel today, but then again not, but then again yes, and so on and so forth. So instead of creativity, I basically decided to look at creation processes. What could also speak here of production in its etymological sense of bringing forth or giving rise to something. Or to speak about instauration, as the French philosopher Etienne Soriot suggests when he speaks about art. And the central issue is that creation, just as I said, production or instauration, is not a mental process, but one which involves engaging with materials, with tools, with technologies, and so on. It is a form of making in the world, a way of engaging with the world and with different materials in a form-giving process. Hence, something it is something that we can observe empirically. And secondly, creation is not about innovation. Instead of dealing with the problem of novelty, creation processes deal with a much more fundamental problem, if you want, or ontological problem, if you want, namely, how can something be brought into being in the first place? Thus, creation, as I said, is much more about this ontological problem of being or not being, and not a sort of evolutionary or historical question about new or old. Now, none of what I have just said is really specific of art or artistic production. Actually, as Bruno Latour, commenting on Etienne Soriot, argues, what fascinates Soriot about art and what fascinates me, Bruno Latour, about the laboratory is the doing of making. The making exists. So instauration or creation understood as this making exists is exactly what science does as well. So scientific facts, I mean, this is kind of the point of the whole STS, Science and Technology Studies tradition. Scientific facts are ontological achievements. They're manufactured, as Karen North-Cetina suggests. I mean, knowledge production is in this sense not about some spiritual or intellectual insight into the reality of things, but about material manipulations, inscriptions, and translations of their actual reality. So basically, you isolate a bacteria, you expose it to different conditions, you let its biological reactions or behavior be inscribed in some sort of material media. You then take these visual inscriptions and translate them into a graph or into a number or into a series of numbers or into sentences, and you work with sentences, and then you have a paper and you publish this paper, and that's a scientific article and eventually might become a scientific fact. So of course, knowledge is about intellectual insight, but it's also about these different material manipulations. And yes, it is an epistemological problem, but it's also an ontological thing, an ontological achievement, an ontological process. So now, the key to understanding scientific ways of making exist or creating knowledge lies in what I just said, these processes and devices of inscription. I mean, this is what kind of actor network theory and science and technology studies have been suggesting for a couple of years. Two extreme examples of these inscription devices are, on the one hand, the particle accelerator at CERN, a huge socio-technical system created to produce collisions between particles, to break them into pieces and to capture with very sophisticated sensors the building blocks of matter. That's one inscription device. On the other hand, a different inscription device are my written notes and audio recordings from my fieldwork, in which I try to capture the way people work in kind of studios. So these are field notes, and particle accelerators are inscription devices, similar in that sense. So the question we need to pose is, what could be the equivalent to inscription for the case of artistic production? So we know that in scientific processes, inscription is the key. So what is the equivalent to inscription for artistic processes? And the hypothesis I've been working with is that the creation of artworks can be understood as not an inscription, but as expression. I take this notion of expression from the pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, who, writing in 1934, argued that focusing on finished artistic objects, paintings, music pieces, and so on, kind of hinders any understanding of arts and aesthetics, and he proposes instead to look at how things are artistically expressed. Now, this can be easily misunderstood. Expression for John Dewey is not a sort of semiotic or symbolic process. It is not about meaning, and it's certainly not about kind of communicating the emotions that the artist might have or anything like that. So it's not about that. When Dewey says expression, he means this literally as a material process of expressing, and he uses a hyphen, expressing artistic forms in the sense of exerting pressure upon material media such as bodies, sound, light, plastic, paper, clay, whatever you want, and squeezing out particular forms out of it. So it's really a material sort of process. His favorite example for this is the juice that is expressed when grapes are crushed in a wine press. So this is an expression process. The example is actually quite good to the extent that it makes evident that this pressure is exercised by very concrete objective things like a wine press, right? So we need to pay attention when we look at artistic processes to these expression devices. So what are the devices, the technologies, the material, the things that are used to express artistic forms. And the example of the wine press is also good because it also makes evident that expression is a construction in time. So it takes time to express anything. So it does not, and this does not just mean that it takes time for the artist to materialize his or her preconceived idea, but actually that both the material form and the concept or the idea of whatever is artistically expressed, they both emerge slowly through this engagement with the media and these expression devices. So that's kind of the starting point. The empirical side I have chosen to observe these expression devices and processes is the studio. And of course, this does not mean that the studio is the only place where you can look at this. Again, in science, you find, for example, the particle accelerator of CERN. This is not located in a laboratory. This is like a much larger thing. And of course, expression processes and devices are not just located in the... So there is no intrinsic relationship between studio and expression, but I guess studios are a nice place to look at this. There is a couple of reasons why this is a good place to look at it. The first one is a historical argument, which is related to the work by Caroline Jones, who looks at the rise and fall of the romantic version of the studio in the mid-20th century North America. And at the end of that book, where she discusses the whole post-studio sort of art, she says basically at the very, one of the last sentences of the book, she says like something like, chances are artists won't be drawn back to the studio, but if they are, so if artists come back to the studio, it will be a radically different place than it was in 1980. In 1948. So what kind of place is this? And she says, well, it will be like a sort of a cyborg machine. And my sense is that the time has come to explore Caroline Jones' hypothesis, especially also given the increasing number of artists that are coming back, remystifying and reconfiguring the studio in all sorts of ways. At least in Berlin, where I happen to live, this is very evident because successful artists can afford like great places, and so they can recondition historical buildings that perhaps are not available in other cities, but there they are available. And so there's all these things going on. Think of Olafur Eliasson's studio at a former brewery, and many other examples that I won't go into this now. Just one interesting thing, I tried to do field work I asked in Olafur Eliasson's studio, and after a couple of conversations with the studio manager, I never saw Olafur himself, of course. But after a couple of conversations with the studio manager, I received this email when they basically said that I will not be allowed to do it. And in the email they said, as you will probably understand, and this is a quote, we are happy to have the studio continuously balancing between measures of demystifications and remystification. So, you know, I mean, there is a whole thing going on nowadays with the studio, I guess, in terms of the remystification of it, which I think we have to look at it in more detail. So, apart from this, there are some methodological things to look at the studio. One very fascinating sort of feature is the sort of radicality of the inside-outside boundary through which the studio is constituted, and this boundary allows a very precise engineering of the studio as a socio-material environment, which is built to ultimately enable nothing but processes of expression. So all this regulation of what comes in and what comes out is also very managed to the last detail. What kind of things come in and come out is a matter of concern to all people involved in general. There is a second thing, which is that the studio, looking at the studio, allows you to take a more kind of perhaps holistic approach to art production. So instead of following one project, the studio, or being in the studio, forces you to observe and understand how the production of artworks is entangled with a lot of other things and activities that are perhaps even not related to the production of artwork, right? So when you look at all these things simultaneously, it is possible to start thinking of the studio as a complex assemblage of things and humans acting together as a sort of this cyber machine idea I mentioned at the beginning. And finally, I guess looking at the studio allows making comparisons with other secluded spaces of creative production, such as the architectural office or the video game development firma, something I will come back to at the very end of the talk if I have time. Now, the type of comparisons I'm interested in is not really oriented at finding what are the intrinsic characteristics of each of the sites. Is not also, nor it is oriented at trying to discover kind of representative patterns of what the studios are for each field. This comparison is much more concrete, and is basically trying to show what things show up here and don't show up somewhere else. And this is something that we have been trying to do in an edited volume that will be, I do some advertisement here. So this is a book that is coming out in a couple of months with Routledge, and it's based on 9 or 10 very detailed kind of studies of creative processes in different fields, and the book tried to explore like different sort of conceptual repertoires to make sense of these processes, and so beyond expression. So I will be talking today mostly about expression, right? But there are a bunch of different concepts that you will find here that authors try to use in order to make sense of this: invention, synthesis, referencing, prototyping, and so on and so forth. But what I would like to do now for the rest of the talk is to focus on one particular case, which I hope it will bring forward some of the kind of key features of this studio studies perspective, but also of the kind of expression process I've been talking about. So let's go to that. Sorry about that. In 2009, I spent almost 3 months actually visiting the studio of Reinhold Reynolds in Berlin, between 2 and 4 times a week, for many hours. And then after that, for another year or so, I sort of follow on a more perhaps episodic way the process of filming 6 easy pieces, which is the 3rd part of the so-called Secrets trilogy. So Reynolds is basically an American filmmaker based in Berlin since 2004. I think if you push me, I would place his work together with people like Julian Rosenfeld or Jesper Jast or Philip Parreno, all artists who kind of work with, create film-based artworks and that engage with sort of cinematic languages and narratives and rely also on cinematic conventions and regarding set design, camera motion, and so on and so forth. Now, what is particularly interesting about Reynolds' work is kind of the central part played by his studio as an experimentation and production site. So when I started my ethnography, Reynolds had already shot 3 films in his Berlin studio, 6 apartments, and the 2 first parts of his Secrets trilogy. And more interestingly, for this, he had developed a very complicated camera system for making these films, right? So if you will forgive me, I will not say much about the meaning or the aesthetics of his films, or about, for example, the sort of representation of the female body. It could be something to talk about, perhaps. But rather, I will focus on how his films have come to be made and literally express with the help of this particular camera system. So accordingly, I guess, accordingly, I guess I will focus on 3 things. First, very concretely, like how the camera system was developed, how the camera system exerts pressure upon the content of the film, and how at the end the camera system itself becomes an artwork. So when I started my ethnography, Reynolds was actually about to start the 3rd part of the trilogy. And at this moment, sort of the work to be made, to put it with Soriot, had only a very vague concept, something about time, something about dreamlike experiences. It had a very unclear time plan, some months, and no budget at all. The only thing clear was how to start, namely rebuilding and actually improving this camera system that was used for filming the 1st and 2nd parts of the trilogy. So let me briefly explain you how this works. This camera system is a camera system that is made to film with a stop motion technique, right? So as you know, stop motion is normally used to make an object appear as though it could move on its own. So you take a picture of an object, you move it a bit, you take another picture, you move it a bit, and so on and so forth, and then it looks as though it could be moving. So in this trilogy, this technique is used to capture the movement, not of objects, but the movement of animated things, such as plants or clocks, which move very, very slowly. So with stop motion, they move a bit faster, right? But also the movement of humans who are obliged to move much slower than normal for the technique to work. Now, here's the problem. Given that shooting a very short sequence of some seconds can take a whole hour, for example, with this technique, some sort of device is needed in order to steadily move the camera around the setting during 1 hour, right? During these very long shooting sessions. So the camera system is made to do that, and it has, as you can see, a long metal axle hanging horizontally from the roof, which can rotate in 360 degrees. It has another metal structure with the photo camera attached to it that can also move, and the camera itself can also move up, down, left, and right. And all these movements that this machine does need to be written down in advance in a computer program, which is sort of running the thing, and of course that needs to be run for the shooting. So the program controls also controls a sort of metal finger, which is this blue thing over there, with which each of the pictures are being made, and so on and so forth. So where does all this comes from? I mean, looking at some of the previous films of Reynolds and talking to him about it, it is possible to recognize kind of two parallel developments that come together in this camera system. First, already in his film Burn and others, he built a camera arm to allow for circular movements of a camera in 360 degrees. Then in 2005, for another film, he decided to put the camera reels on the roof, not on the ground as it is normally the case, and the idea was to make easier to move the camera more freely around the set, and this also enabled having it up there to make concave circular movements and not just the convex circular movements that you often have with crane tripods, right? So anyway, apart from this, for Sugar as well, he started using this stop motion function of a video camera, but only for kind of static shoots. Anyway, the footage was not really used for that film, and in 2007 or 6, for this other film, he used both things. On the one hand, the circular movements, and on the other hand, stop motion technique, but also only static shots. And these two things sort of were combined in Secret Life, which is this film, because what Reynolds wanted to do was precisely to film the movement of plants. Now, apart from this kind of genealogical story, there are a number of more intimate stories about every single piece of the system, which I heard during the months doing the fieldwork. Now, these stories were told for practical purposes in order to understand why certain things cannot be made differently, or to be aware of a particular kind of problem that these things pose, because the whole system is built with pieces that were originally designed for other functions. So, for example, the circular Guden structure up there is, for example, made of the Guden baseboards of the studio itself, or the motors, which are kind of moving the different parts of the system, were taken from old step motors of printers, which were found abandoned in the streets or bought at flea markets, and so on and so forth. So the whole process of building this machine relied on a sort of material consciousness, to use this term by Richard Sennett, and that results from touching these heterogeneous objects and discovering with the hands what they are, or what they could be good for. So interestingly also was that during the whole process, all these things, all the bits and pieces of the system had absolutely no names. They were called basically by demonstrative pronouns such as this, that, those, these, which acquire meaning only indexically. Accordingly, their identity as objects was very open to the situation, not fixed in advance. And yes, so the process in which Reynolds and his assistants engaged in was mostly about kind of tuning the system, but also, and this is interesting, without sort of sketches or a fixed set of instructions about how to make it work. So actually fixing the system in any state was very difficult, and when something didn't work as expected, the problem had to be explored or redefined again from zero, more or less, for there was no one fixed way in which the system was supposed to work. So this sort of reveals that the system and its pieces were not designed and then made, but kind of rather grew organically in the studio. So and in that sense, it kind of becomes also evident that the first time this system was built, this was not simply a sort of a technical solution for an already existing, defined artistic problem. I mean, even though sometimes Reynolds himself would explain this in these terms and suggest that this filming technique is a technical solution or a technical translation, more precisely, of the philosophical problem of time, which is that time is always like a phenomenological construction made from putting together present impressions. So, and this is what the system does, it takes pictures, put them together, and time emerges. So this is, of course, there is something in that, and this is one way of explaining this. But the more intimate story of building the system is not a story of problem solving. Anyway, I just wanted to briefly show how it works, right? So this is the footage. So you get the idea. Because as I said, it's not just about sort of this solution, problem solving, but the more intimate stories about how this concept developed is much more intricate. This is a nice quote. While trying to understand how plants grow, I am trying to understand how the camera moves. What I imagine happened to me is that I asked myself, what is the difference between a plant and a machine? So every day I am watering the plant, wondering if they are dying or moving, plus at the same time I am trying to make a camera system move and work and figure out the mechanics of it. So I'm very involved in these questions in a practical and a philosophical way, and after many days it becomes like the question of the film. So as we see here, it is the artistic concept that grew together with the system. It is not a mental construction elaborated before actually building the system or created afterwards to make sense of it, but rather a central part of the engagement with materials, these life forms and machines that are all present in the studio. So then I wanted to say a little bit something about how the system is shaping the way the scenes are being prepared for this film. And I will just go very briefly about this. I mean, basically the point that I wanted to make in this part is that actually the ideas for each of the specific scenes that might become part of the film at the end of the process were also being explored in a very open way during the very process of building the system. So when we were working there, one day the main actress kind of show up there, and then Reynolds and she start talking for a while, and then she briefly mentioned that she has started ballet classes, and it also happened that Reynolds had just received an invitation to apply for a scholarship, which was like in some classical musician, and the only requirement that was to do a sort of piece of work in which you would engage with the music of that musician, right? So after she started talking about the ballet classes and so on and so forth, and then kind of this connection was made, like, okay, perhaps we can integrate like a ballet scene in the new film, and with that also apply to that. So and a whole process started of kind of experimenting with the different sort of positions that you do in ballet, and it was a very funny thing. We were all laughing about the fish and about all these kind of ballet positions and so on and so forth. And then after that, at some point, Reynolds made the point of saying like, well, but this is all very interesting, but the key issue is whether you can do these ballet positions taking into account the constraints of the camera systems that forces you to maintain this position for a whole hour if you want to make a film out of it. So it's a very nice example of how, on the one hand, this process of developing ideas was inspired by casual encounters with people and but at the same time it was heavily constrained by the system. And so the question was whether any sort of idea could actually endure the system. So this is kind of the kind of challenge. And then there was this a second example that I wanted to point to of this. Again, it's about kind of this process of figuring out which concrete scenes will be made. As I said, instead of there is no script in general for this. There are just some sort of images, and which are kind of connected to a camera sequence, and the rehearsal process is also about mainly following. This is another. The videos are not working. I'm sorry about this, guys. So the rehearsal process. There you go. So these rehearsal processes is about following the orders of the camera system, and kind of Reynolds is playing the camera and showing people what they have to do according to how the camera moves. So it's very interesting when you talk about it with these actors, and the main actress, for example, she speaks of acting for the system. And she could actually explain to me how she, during the process, she has learned to adapt her body movements and reactions to the sound of the camera in order to rest, for example, between one picture and the next, and then come back to the previous position. And she has also learned how to breathe following sort of the beats of the camera and so on and so forth. Other collaborators that we don't see here, such as the set designer, would also explain that she feels that she has to work not just with the system, but also against the system in order to sort of counteract the monotonous aesthetics that the camera systems produces. And all these examples sort of suggest the camera system is the sort of the main expression device in this film production, exerting pressure in all sorts of ways upon the bodies, upon the materials and entities that are involved in these films, and also expressing a very specific type of aesthetics. But beyond this, I guess it is also interesting to point out that the system is not just putting constraints, but is also can act as a sort of creative agent. To the extent that the system is introducing all sorts of variations without really the artist or anyone else making any decisions. I mean, a good example of this, how the system becomes a creative agent, happened also while rehearsing the camera movement for the scene that we just saw, right? At the beginning of this sequence, you saw that, I mean, here you can see it, like the camera has to approach the actress, and it's supposed to go just sort of beside this painting frame over there. It's supposed to go just beside. But in one of these rehearsals, as the camera started to move, it went right into the middle of the canvas, and as it was about to touch the canvas, one of the assistants take the canvas out, and so and the result was sort of great, because when you look at it, it was as though the camera would have just entered the camera and sort of enter a pictorial space, and the system somehow did it with nobody really deciding anything. So it is obviously not an intentional actor, of course, but its own sort of imperfections granted some sort of agency. And indeed, on many occasions, as these kind of things happen, I could hear Julia, the assistant who was in charge of programming camera movements, complaining and saying things like, it's not the numbers, it's the machine. And I could see Reynolds looking very worried and concluding that we are not really in control of the whole thing. So just to conclude, I haven't mentioned one important thing of this last scene that you can see here is that it actually did not happen in the studio. This happened all in a gallery space. Now, how the system ended up in this gallery space is yet another kind of story that in a sense it was also made possible by this very camera system and which actually changed the way, and as I will just explain, the way in which Reynolds has been making films since then. So the more perhaps prosaic side of the story is that in September 2009, for kind of strange contractual reasons, Reynolds had to rather suddenly leave the studio he had been working in since 2006. So from 1 week to the next, more or less, he had to leave with all his stuff. And this happened at the same time, only some weeks before a solo show he was doing at a small gallery in Berlin. This was actually his third solo exhibition in the city in less than 3 years, apart from many other kind of group exhibitions. So actually he was feeling that he had nothing new to show because he had been showing so much in the city, so he was like really feeling that he had nothing new to show. And then this situation happened that he had to leave the studio, and all this combined ended up with Reynolds kind of taking up the suggestion of a curator friend about installing the camera system in the gallery space. And the show that he would show would be shooting the next film, sort of transforming the process into the product, so to speak. So the show at the gallery at the end involved six filming performances, each held on a Saturday night, and the audience, as you can see here, could observe the process of filming a scene with the camera system from the street through the gallery window. And the invitation to the show, which actually attracted a large audience, included a very suggesting quote by Bruce Nauman, where he says basically that if I was an artist and I was in the studio, then whatever I was doing in the studio must be art, and at this point art became more of an activity and less of a product. But there was also a product actually coming out of this, namely the third part of the Secrets trilogy, which Reynolds then called 6 Easy Pieces. I mean, the story is actually fascinating for reasons that go beyond the practical things I just mentioned. Yeah, I mean, and also, yeah, I'm about to finish. Give me 2 minutes. And also beyond the fact that this is a sort of quite innovative way of showing the art process. I mean, the key to understanding how this was enabled is paying attention to the way in which this slow motion filming process kind of produces a very spectacular, if you want, performance of art making, in which a performance in which what is at stake is the way in which this fascinating expression device exerts pressure upon the bodies of actors, slowing down their movements for a long period of time, almost to the limits of the physically possible. So the audience that is there can really experience in a very intensified form the fragile and also quite extreme process of expressing artistic forms, and see how the actors sort of fight to control their own bodies, and how their muscles begin to tremble, or how they sweat, or how they actually suffer. All this while the sort of camera system moves slowly and continuously, and orchestrating with each of its movements and a whole assemblage of bodies and so on. And you also see Reynold and his team shouting, giving instructions to the actors, asking them to endure, ensuring them that it will soon be over. And so, in a sense, the performance is also not just about what is being filmed, but it's also about the work and the tension among the filming crew, who are, as I said before, are talking loudly to each other, dictating numbers, fixing bags, and so on and so forth. So in a way, the performance is reversed and sort of against the immobility of the actors, the artist, the team becomes the place of intensified activity. So, well, this is the story, and this is something we can discuss afterwards, perhaps. Which is basically what I've been doing here is just kind of discussing this machinic expression, but if we continue to think about how materials kind of play a role in and how you engage with materials in very different contexts, we actually find out that there are many different ways of doing this, and things like projection or immersion are also quite relevant for the cases of whatever architecture and video game developers. But we can talk about this later. But I mean, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Dear colleagues, any questions of clarification to ask?
Just a quick question. As far as the kinds of art productions you're looking at, are you mostly focusing on film or a whole range of different kinds of artistic production?
Actually, I have had two main case studies. One is film, and the other is kind of between installation and photography, sort of. So these are the kind of two, but in a sense, in those type of productions, things like cameras also play a central role, but also objects that are installed in very particular ways in the landscape, for example.
I'm just wondering if that aspect of it drew you to particular kinds of
concepts
production versus another kind of art production potentially. So where machines could, I mean, it would be very different, but I'm just wondering how you're determining your cases.
Yeah. Actually, in the case of art, is the most complicated one because of the variety of kind of practices. I mean, in the case of architecture, is you of course you have some sort, but I mean, in terms of the programs being used and so on and so forth, there is some sort of a common ground. So actually, I started this in a very open way, like basically taking whatever I get, and then and this is what I got, and after that I chose a second case that could be could make sense and could expand some of the findings that I had here. So that's why these object installations that are being photographed was, I thought, a good case, like moving towards sculpture and installation, but still having cameras as a common topic to think about. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to think about here is about the role of these optic devices for producing particular aesthetics.
Yeah, I have two actually, but application ones. So. Well, thank you. It was very interesting. The first one, your fieldwork was in 2009, and then a year later, right? You were sent to. No. I basically I did a participant observation in the studio. Can you give the exact date? Kind of from February to May, and we spent most of the time basically rebuilding the system and trying out a number of things. And after that, I started because during those 3 months, I was there like 2 to 3, even 4 days a week, and half a day or longer. And after that, I was going like once a week or something like that. And then until and kind of following the process until September. In September, it was this show, And then after that, I continue following up new processes that started. And actually, it's very interesting because the whole practice of this guy changed after that exhibition. I mean, he's not doing anymore the kind of things that he was doing before. He's been doing a lot of, showing the filming has become a central part of his practice. And I was lucky to just see it, how it happened.
Yeah, it would be interesting to discuss how the camera system evolves, and yeah, but probably you know something about the previous years, how it was coming into being, but it's maybe for the later discussion.
Okay.
And the second one is about your creative process. Did you come up with the expression idea beforehand or afterwards?
Afterwards. I mean, not during the field work.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, not during the field work.
Okay, the question is, so I would like to ask about the figure of director, because, so Reynolds in this case, because of course he is not like a free actor who would like to do everything he wants, and we would like to see the routine practice where it is connected with artistic practices, but it seems that he was the main figure there, and he made decisions where to stop, or what to take, what scene could be selected, and so on. He's system builder in this way, or not? So what you could say about this?
Yeah, sorry about the bit messy last part of the talk because I was trying to cut and anyway, there was a point there I skipped, which is a great kind of conversation I had with him about this, and he said basically that in the past, whatever that is, he was doing films with a friend, kind of co-authoring these films, and he was like, and we were discussing for ages, about every single detail, like the color of the wall or things like that, and whatever, like these kind of things. But with time, I've learned that actually, when you are in a filmmaking process, only about 20% of the decisions are relevant, and the rest is not relevant. So now I try to focus on the 20%. And so things like, he's basically trying to orchestrate a huge crew, which each member brings a number of things into it, but he's trying to focus on those decisions that are kind of key in order to achieve the kind of film that he wants to make. And my point is that, in a sense, these decisions, I mean, you cannot put numbers to it, but a good part of that 20%, it is also inscribed in this system. So building the system is a way of letting the set designer, the set designer to do whatever she wants. I mean, he said we had conversations about this. Like, I don't care whatever she will. I mean, I just give her a direction, and whatever she does is fine. I don't care whether it is like this or that element on the table. I mean, I need a canvas. That's true. And the machine is making the film to evolve in a particular direction. So it's an interesting case to discuss in terms of system building, and because it's not a holistic sort of attempt at kind of controlling every single aspect of it.
Now the publics are involved as actors and crew into this, or
well, in the sorry, pardon, the public
involves the publics, right, into the process.
Yeah, but it did mention this. Yeah, but this is the case in the not in this film that I showed, but in the most.
Are the actors there or members of the crew? I mean, those who make the camera system running? How does he, in which role he involves the publics?
I mean, this is something that has happened, as I said, after there was this show, and after that he started making kind of other films and so on, in which the camera system didn't play a role without the camera system.
I mean, some with and some without. But the point is that he started to systematically show the filming process in gallery spaces, in museums, and so on. And in some occasions, he could invite everyone they could have a set with whatever, like a bar. So everybody would be invited to sit there and with, well, you know, in historical clothes, and just sit there while they are filming something. And so it's a performance. So the whole filming becomes a performance that is shown in museums and galleries. But the system, the technical system is now not so relevant. I mean,
so the publics are involved not as participants, but as observers.
Well, in that case, they are involved as participants. They are involved as how you call them, the people in the background of a film. You know.
Yeah, the mass.
Yeah, the mass. Yeah. So.
Yeah, in Russian we have Basov.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe I have a question. Thank you so much as well. It's very interesting and very, how to say, powerful for me, particularly presentation, because I had experienced in my life to be involved in some groups of Leningrad and Petersburg artists, and I visited several different ateliers, but this is a completely, I have an expression of a feeling of a kind of estrangement, because I visited, for example, a huge studio of famous sculptor Mikhail Anikushin in 90s. He's a famous, you can see his sculpture of Lenin, for example, and so on. So it was really a huge studio and quite a material production. Yes. That is my question. Do you think to attend maybe a studio of sculpture, because exactly this type of art production is real material, way of doing artistic work? That's my first question. The second question, of course, a bit later, of course, I know quite good Petersburg studios of some underground artists, and one important way of living in such a studio is common drinking and some, you know, this form of typically, maybe not typically Russian artistic social life, but drinking is a very important process.
Of course.
You take into account these forms of cooperation in artistic process. One is, because of course my small commentary is that video art is, to me at least, is completely, to my understanding and my memory as well, is completely strange, because in comparison with painting, sculpture, or music, I just remember Shevchuk video. I was translator for Yuri Shevchuk, and for some time it was music game, some music play and some common conversation, common sitting, drinking, but not such a video, because video, I think, these technical devices, for me, have some kind of estrangement effect.
I see.
Because it's not human connectedness, some kind maybe conviviality in this process, but it's exactly working with technique, with video, and video is a kind of, sorry.
I see what you mean.
But
I mean,
commentary and maybe this question of this sociality. Did you take into account this common drinking or something else?
I got it. Well, actually, it is perhaps relevant to say that if you go to John Dewey, and when he's talking about expression, he's really, he doesn't, well, he gives some examples, but you really realize that he's thinking about sculpture. So, as a practice, I mean, the whole way he's thinking of it is, it's really kind of with sculpture in mind, in terms of this exerting pressure upon materials in order to squeeze out a particular form. This is kind of sculpture. So I guess that I mean, I guess I took that a little bit into account, that to make this argument for sculpture could be very easy, I thought. And actually, when, I mean, on the one hand, okay, this is what I got in terms of access, but I was very happy of having access to this process, because it is often the case that these more digital or visual kind of processes are being thought as immaterial or things like that, and trying to show how this happens in this type of processes was a more challenging sort of project for me, at least. And actually, I fully disagree with the with your point about that this is a case in which there is no human or something like that connectedness. Actually, what we see here is a very tight entanglement of bodies, of machines, of computer programming, and these things cannot really be divided. I mean, the dividing lines between how a body behaves and how computer programming is controlling things is not clear. So actually, it is it's a case in which you encounter a very tight entanglement of whatever humanity, and this it's basically a cyborg sort of process. So I think that's and the sociality aspect in this particular case, drinking and stuff, it actually happened mostly outside this particular studio. I know, of course, there are, but I guess that's. But in this case, I was going to a number of parties and stuff, but they don't happen to take place in the studio, but in other places.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. No commentary, because this human dimension is voice. I did not voice, because in this conversation, people voiced expression, so voice is important connecting element.
Yeah.
But in this case, entanglement is not followed by voicing, by some kind of dialogue, because you cannot be in dialogue with machine, with another participant in this process, human participant.
Well, I guess the next talk will be about communication and material, so we will see how that plays out.
So actually, this is the first time we're presenting, I think, presenting this stuff in the scientific environment sessions. It will be about it's based, the talk is based on the Knockout project, which is about evolution of knowledge and communication networks in material contexts, where we are interested to infer into these evolution processes at micro level, and chose as an object artistic groups who share spaces. We have six cases, which are located around Europe, and so probably won't list them. So 2 of them in Spain, 1 in UK, 1 in Germany, and 2 here in Russia. And well, the final goal is that we do the dynamic analysis. So we have 4 waves of data collection. The first one was in this autumn, 2014. The second one is taking place right now, and then we have 2 more later within a half-year interval between them. So what we do here is trying to trace the complex structures, which are called multi-level networks, and we have 3 networks here, which are concepts network, actors network, and objects network. And we consider relations within each of the sets, and also the relations across them, as individuals, for instance, use concepts, or as they use objects, or as the concepts are ascribed to objects, making those like meaningful or expressed in discourse, described in discourse. So as a result, we have the 6 types of networks here. We are analyzing different combinations, and here we present a piece of static analysis we've been doing based on the first wave data, and here it is more about the first 5 networks here, which are circulating around the material objects, which comprise the material context. And here we will talk about our reflections and analysis about how material objects and the structure of material objects is related to the structure of interpersonal relations and the structure of meanings, which is generated within the groups. And probably Anisya will follow.
Exactly. So as to the theoretical frame that we kind of used as a ground, there are 2 columns in here, the 2 pillars, both of them being cited by Ignacio already. One is quite rather clearly Bruno Latour with his idea of heterogeneous networks constituted both by human beings and by non-humans, by things, and as you remember, both act as actons, which means that they are fully involved in the agency and interaction, and therefore influence both the development and the reproduction of the network. And in other words, it is important for us that material objects can be seen not simply as kind of, tools of communication or elements of infrastructure, or finally the projections of the social world, but rather as sharers of activities and mobilities, which are often very important for human beings. And another theoretical pillar is the idea of Knorr-Cetina, according to which we can consider many environments today as object-centered sociality, which means that the environments experience an increasing importance of things, of objects, and she actually says that not all objects are equally important for the development of social relations. Different things associated with different meanings provoke various emotional responses and have different potential to generate motivation or communication or solidarities. And to comparatively analyze those capacities, she introduces analytical opposition of epistemic versus technical objects. According to her, the technical objects are normally quite stable and their meanings are quite transparent, thus unproblematic for the users who are normally pragmatic users. And the epistemic objects are different because they are more open, changeable. They are processes rather than something already finished once and forever, and therefore they are open for interpretations and very meaningful. And interestingly, it's not the pragmatic function that is core for their value, but rather symbolic goods that they make, which means that sometimes they are more valuable for other things that they bring along, such as, for example, higher status or connections or something else. And therefore, they are always works in progress. They are opened for change. They are repeatedly related to. And therefore, they have high chances in evoking emotional attachment and moral responsibility. People even tend to identify themselves with such objects, which gives rise to new solidarities. Okay, and of course, when we started our project, it was very important to us to understand how we should design our empirical research in order to trace those connections between the communication of artists, the meaning making they're involved in, and finally the material context. And here, of course, we were very well aware that we will face certain challenges. The basic challenge is very well known for those who are doing the everyday life sociology, which is that many things that people, in our case artists, would use are everyday life objects, which are part of the routines people share, and therefore they are hardly thought of and the more so spoken about. So how to grasp them? We obviously see from this challenge that probably interviewing, which was one of our main methods, would not be very useful or very helpful in this situation. Okay, then we probably have to opt for observation, as you also did. But the problem is that we were very interested in the regular use of objects in artistic studios in their shared spaces. However, we couldn't provide the necessary regularity of being there in the field, because like ideal, you have to be there for at least half a year, every day, every moment, because the creative process, the communication through objects is unfolding quite often and quite unpredictably, so you never know when it is there, when it's not. For many studios in some of the cities that we investigated, especially in one of the cases that I will present a bit later, Fries in Hamburg, there were additional challenges of some parts of this artistic house, the Künstlerhaus, being closed for the observation because there were private studios where artists would stay part of the time while sharing other parts of the space where they only were presented rarely. So this irregularity observation was another challenge which kind of constrained the observation potential. And finally, of course, there was also the situational character of observation. For example, we happened to come to the field when the artist would produce some artistic object. Okay, and we know what other objects are involved in the process. But if we happen to come in another time, we'll probably see yet another combination of objects coming into force. Or a very fresh example, together with Ekaterina, we were now entering the second wave of doing the field material collection in Germany. And in winter, our artists would describe only, generally the plants that they have in the garden, like with the general label of plants. Because it was winter, it was not relevant for them. Now it's spring, everything is flourishing, and suddenly the label of plants, the object of plants is splitting into like a dozen of objects of different plants, a rose, a tree, and so on and so forth. What to do, how to compare. And of course, yet another problem that emerges is that if we are reduced in the observation possibilities, we have to ask again. And we did that by introducing the method of photo elicitations, by showing the photos of spaces artists would share and asking them about what they see and how they use it. But of course, that means provoking a very artificial narrativization of the objects to induce stories that would never probably appear but for us, because very often the object usage is part of tacit knowledge that is non-spoken, as in your example. So what we had to do in the end is to find out a combination of methods where triangulation would probably amend some of those challenges. And this is what we have in the end, a very complex structure of methods where we used a sociometric survey to grasp the communication relations of the artists, but also the way they collaborate and the emotional attachment they feel to each other. We used in-depth interviews to get most of their conceptualizations of their own work and relations to each other. We added also the observations of artists interacting. That's actually part of your answer about drinking. Yes, we observed drinking as well, and it was a very important part for us. Much of drinking in all cases. Also, we observed the space and how space is used. In addition, we also did excursions around the space, asking artists to show us around. Then the photo elicitation, which I have already described, and also if some of the communities would work together on joint artistic projects, would also add up the artistic work solicitation, which means that artists would comment on the photos of their own artworks. So we hope that together that will give the possibility to create all the networks that Nikita has already listed.
So resulting from this, for each case, we ended up with lists of relations in the 6 dimensions, 6 kind of networks I mentioned before, like actor concept, actor object, object concept, and object. So all of them for each case, based on which we built the networks. And we will get to the specific stuff here, just presenting the cases.
Exactly. Yeah, here, for the sake of this presentation, we decided to limit ourselves with 2 cases only, because we feel that there we have the maximal variation, so to say. In the upper part of the slide, you have the case of Friese community in Hamburg. This case is really unique because the artists working in Friese have been together for decades. In fact, the old Künstler house, literally, the first Künstler house, which then developed into Friese, was established 36 or 37 years ago, and some of the members are still there. And many others would join later, but they're still there for many, many years. And there, of course, many of them would be also connected with friendships. The community is rather big. It includes almost 30 members. And what is important about the space they share is that the majority of artists would have their separate studios or ateliers where they work, but simultaneously they share other parts of the house, like the exhibition room or the guest artist residence, or also, you know, the yard, the garden, some store rooms, and many other things. And there are also many objects that the artists would use and own jointly. And also is very important to mention that they don't work collectively on artistic projects, or it's rather an exception for them. Instead, they would work on independent projects but collaborate in organizational terms to make the house run, to invite new artists to come there as guests, to collaborate with the city administration, and so on and so forth. Unlike them, Basov in Madrid works very often on joint projects, which are normally connected with a very specific issue, which is rubbish or trash. They use trash as a material for their artistic works, and they often go into the public space of the city by playing with this material and the artifacts that develop out of that. Basov is much smaller and currently involves 9 artists. Many of them would come from the same educational background. Basov was established in 2001. It is quite old, but not as old as Friese. And also importantly here, the artists would share not only projects, but also the space. They would be working together in the same rooms. Okay, this scary picture shows the very final outcome of our analysis. At each of these pictures,
it's not the final.
Okay, it's a general representation of our attempts, because here we have a joint representation of the networks that we have constructed so far. So here you have the actors in the middle. You also have the ties between those and the objects. It's moving, it's moving. And finally, the central conceptualizations, the meanings that the artist would share. The core word here is share, because what we have here is only the shared objects and only the shared concepts.
And only the concepts which are used to describe objects. So it's like the very core where all the 3 types of nodes are interconnected. principally.
And this is, for example, the socio-cultural network of Farias, as we call it. And what you immediately grasp is, you know, those groups of objects that you have here and here. It is non-typical for other communities that you have groupings of objects so obviously connected to each other on the final scheme. So we grew interested in seeing what's inside, how those groupings are organized inside, and we'll show it a bit later. But to compare, here is the network of Basorama, and you see that here we don't have such obvious groupings, right? Instead, the objects are more equally spread around the network and connected to the artists, and that's probably because you have all the spaces shared, and all the artists practically, using same objects. But if we look closer into this picture, we'll probably discover again that some of the groupings are still there. And to compare it with Farias, we also picked up some of such groupings and decided to look closer at what we have there. Okay, that is a complicated story, because that's what we did using Concord algorithm, which would group people depending on what objects they would rather use. So let's go to the first picture and see. That's how Basorama would split according members. You see people there and there. Some of them are in blue. I hope you mentioned that. Those are in red. And you see that some people would rather use those objects, and some people would rather use those objects. And there we have a group of objects that are connected with the work on an artistic project, which is called Lucha letters. And there are, of course, people who were participating in the project, and therefore they are rather connected with those things. But there is another grouping of people who are rather associated with another group of objects. That's actually everyday life objects. There you have, the sofa where they have rest, or table which they where they have dinner, or probably some entertainments they use. Right? So the question arises, whereas those different groups of objects would be also associated with different types of communication or relation arising between artists, but also with different semantic structures.
Yeah, so here we're talking about the objects they share. So the blue ones are the ones more shared by the blue group, and the red ones more by the red group. So like this. This is a group actually which was running this project, Lucha Letters, and they all, well, it's quite expectable that they are the ones who mostly share the objects which are involved in this project. This is actually the results. Huge Luvo, it is luxury red. We write in translation, it's something like luxury. Luxury. Translated from, when it was assembled.
Yeah, but interestingly, all those huge colorful letters are made of trash again, from plastic bags, for example. Yeah, and here is the example of making. And we see some of the objects that will be relevant for us later. Let us show them now the photo of the dinner to finalize this.
You mean this one?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the everyday life and how they would share, Okay, let us now proceed with Freezer and see what Concord gives us here. And here again, we have obviously two fields, one in red, one in blue. And some artists would rather be connected with the usage of these objects, which are in red, and some with blue ones. And what we get here is that the people marked red would normally be using the groups that we're interested in. Who are those people? For some exceptions, those are the old-timers of the community, all connected with the relations of friendships and personal emotional attachment. But also there are importantly people who not only work in the shared studios but also live there, because there is a possibility to live there in the studios in Friese. Unlike them, the people who are using blue objects are more or less newer members who only use the objects that belong to their shared studio. Some of them would use a studio in groups of 2 or 3, and they would be people who are only working in the studios rather than living in them. But you probably see, no, too early, that you also have. Okay. No. Okay, but I can also do like that. Like that. Okay, here in the red part we have 2 groups of objects. One is connected with people spending their time in the garden. Now you can make it closer to see how it looks like. A very nice yard where people would grill, barbecue, party. Another group is the guest studio, where the visiting artists participating in the projects of Friese would live, but when the space is free of guests, people could also gather there, both for partying and formal meetings, but also for the so-called general meetings to establish some questions of great importance for the whole community. And now we have this third part of the structure where suddenly you have the mixture of red and blue objects, which is very rare for this community, and that's the bar space where people from Friese but also the outsiders would regularly meet for openings of the exhibitions, and where all the members would gather together, where everybody would be communicating to each other. And here is the picture from the bar of how it looks materially. And okay, then we decided to look even further on how artists would use the material objects, and Nikita will comment on how we did that.
Yeah, we don't have much time, so I'll try to do it briefly. So the point here is that the first thing, we made a network out of similarities in patterns of object usage. So we correlated actors as they use objects, and where we had strong, meaningful correlations, we had ties, and we didn't put ties where the correlations were below the average among the community. So here is a Friese network we came up with, the same we did with Basov, and actually we did that for all the communities studied. Then we took the actor networks, which are the examples are to the right. We have here networks of regular collaborations. We have networks of emotional attachment between the members, and we also took, not displayed here, the networks of regular interactions between the members. And there is this technique which is called CAP correlation procedure, quadratic assignment procedure, which what it does, it correlates the networks consisting of the same nodes, and it the resulting coefficient shows to what extent the existence of tie in one network corresponds to existence of tie in another one. So for instance, if we take a network of object usage similarity and take the network of emotional attachment, we can test whether in this or that community we have emotional attachments between individuals corresponding to similar usage of similar objects, and to what extent this co-occurrence is statistically significant. It generates, like in these cases we did I think 5,000 of permutations of the networks, and it compares the actual result to the random permutations and gives the statistics based on that. So we ended up with this. It's for all the communities. We have Basov as B and Farias as F here, and we see that for emotions and collaborations network, the correlations are normally, well, often quite high. Sometimes it's 60 or even more. I won't speak about interactions here because later we focus on collaborations and emotions. And for Basov and Farias, in both cases, we have in these two dimensions of actor-actor ties, we have significant correlations. And for Basov, it's above medium. And for Farias, it's there is also some, but it's not that much. It's like 26 and 27%. Yeah. So
yeah, but why is that? We expect that is because in Basov we have both the collaboration, which is very strong, and also the shared space, which is much more shared than in Farias. Let's check whether it works on more qualitative analysis.
So they have the chance to come together, use same objects, and maybe to be related interpersonally as well at the same time. Farias, there is far less chances for that because there is less shared space and shared objects.
Okay, so now let us go even deeper into the networks. Nikita, deeper.
Sure.
And see how the networks of objects are connected with the people who use them. For example, this is, remind you, the leisure zone, and there are 4 people who will be either using or more speaking about using those. And we see that all the 4 people are connected with emotional attachment ties, which are red.
So those are the people who use those objects?
Yes, I told that, yes. And it's only one blue link of collaboration, which is very secondary because the 2 people connected with it are actually lifetime partners, so for them collaboration is a side effect. Yeah, so, okay, so what is meaningful, what is important here is that the friends would, and people who all those 4 are living in the house would use or speak about the usage of such objects. And what is also important, they are core for initiating different informal events in the house, and therefore you have the integrating objects associated with leisure and informal communication, and people who would normally initiate such communication. And as to another bunch of objects, here the picture is very different. What you probably obviously see here is that the people who use the objects in the gas studio air not only use not only have the emotional attachment, although they do, but also have loads of collaborations. Why is that? It's because the studio with all the objects located there is not only used for informal communication, which is also the case, but is also strictly connected to responsibilities of work and collaboration. The artists from the studio would actively involved in looking for guest artists, inviting them, curating their exhibitions, going into those exhibitions as participants as well, and therefore this immediately shows up in the network. How about Basov? Here is the first bunch, where we have the artistic objects in the center, the very installation of Lucha letters, and what we expectedly have here is the people who will be participating in the making of this installation, who are of course very often connected with collaborative ties, not only emotional attachment. What is actually disappointing is not a sufficient number of such collaborating ties, which shows the limitations of method, because we did, as researchers, observe the collaboration that was there. But according to the sociometric questionnaire, we know that those collaborations are not regular. People don't admit they are regular collaborators. As to another group of objects, it is the one that is connected with the leisure activities and rest and joint everyday life activities. And what we get here is even more collaborative ties along with the emotional attachment ones. That's probably, again, because many of the members there are just by definition collaborators, because many of them, almost all of them, are involved in collaborative patterns working together on the same projects. So you just cannot bracket them, even if we speak about the everyday life routines that accompany the creative process. Now we try to look at what happens to the meanings.
You have to tell it first.
Yeah, okay. Then we decided to learn what happens with the meanings that people ascribe to the objects that we now distinguished, how they would conceptualize those objects. And we first developed the semantic network for the two groups of objects which we have in the freezer. What we got in the end,
we mapped it and tried to trace the shared conceptualizations.
Exactly.
Naming of objects, or say concepts used to name the objects by more than one individual, and we try to trace that.
Exactly. So how people would describe the objects that they would use. And we now only focus on shared concepts that at least two people would refer to. And what we have here is no conceptualizations, just zero. Why is that?
Shared.
At least shared ones. Probably the everyday life objects that people in freezer would use don't have to name or conceptualize the objects, because it's tacit knowledge, like in the talk we had earlier. Probably it's because it's unspoken, and therefore they don't want or need to speak about that. However, there are still some objects in the freezer space which are strongly conceptualized. Guess what? Is the it's the bar.
I really like this one. I think it's helpful to explain.
Okay, so because it's actually the area where, as you remember, both groups of artists, the older ones, the new ones, those who are living, those who are not living, do meet. And probably that's why the bar area is stronger conceptualized than other groups of objects. Can you now show how it looks?
Sure. Presentation enforcing our talk.
Here, you see that it's really strongly conceptualized. For example, the central object of the bar counter has just dozens of concepts that people share. That's a very high, level in comparison to other. We're already finishing with other objects that we have traced. And how about Basorama?
I would mention here that maybe, well, if for this case we have the new ones, new ones. We have those who live there and the most involved members, and the less involved members, those who come there on a less regular basis, to come together to produce some semantics.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Yeah. Okay. So both it's meaningful for the identity of the members as the meeting point.
To objects, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. And now let us do the same for Basorama to conclude. And we also started with the conceptualization of everyday life objects, which are technical in the terms of Knorr-Cetinė. And we see that there is a very big number of conceptualizations with all those everyday life objects. You see, they are shared, so people would speak in similar terms about the everyday life objects they share. Okay. But now we proceed with another groups of objects where in the center we have the artistic object, which of course in the terms of Knorr-Cetinė would be epistemic. So as you remember, epistemic objects are expected to evoke more emotional responses and even to produce solidarities. Does that mean that in this case we will have more conceptualization? We do expect that because that's how the theory says. And as you see, the reality goes against our expectations because the very central object of Lucho letters, the installation, has no single shared conceptualization. What a disappointment. At this point, we probably had to cease our analysis, but then we decided to check whether there were conceptualizations produced by artists that were not shared, that were unique for each and every artist. And when we did that, the picture changed, because you see that there are pretty many conceptualizations produced by the artists, but that are not shared. And here our interpretation is that probably the epistemic objects as objects in the making, things in the making, they are changeable, as you remember. They are open for new meanings, for new interpretations, and probably that reflects in the ways people speak about that, because they do have those different interpretations and express them differently. Okay, and to conclude, you probably saw that now our project is still, again, as an epistemic object, something in the making, but we already see that the method, in spite of the limitations, would seem to work and arise some of the very interesting and promising findings. And yeah, that's a serial lesson that I follow. And actually what we feel for now is that probably this analytical distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic objects can also be productive in further analysis to see how this connection between the communication of the artists, their meaning structures, and finally the material context where their communication and labor is embedded in are related.
Yeah. But to trace that, we probably will have to give up the restriction about sharing of conceptualizations, at least when it comes to epistemic objects, to see something, how it is described in semantics. Which something we didn't do. It's also interesting to see how the concepts themselves are connected and in which pieces of the semantic network they are built in, to see which meanings are ascribed and given to those concepts we have as like single words here, but it's actually quite huge semantics behind it out of thousands of concepts.
Exactly. That's our development for the future, but for now, thank you very much for your attention.
Now many questions of clarification.
Well, I have a couple.
Basically, they all relate to the way you build the map name database. I mean, just one example. I mean, I was looking at the paella pan, and the concept. So you had the paella pan as an object, and then there was a concept attached to it, which was the concept of paella. So I was wondering to what extent the name of a meal, why the name of a meal made it into a concept, and then more generally I was wondering how did you actually decide what counts as a concept and or not.
That's the thing. Well,
yeah.
Every single word was a possible.
So it's
except the the terms which are like pronouns and.
Yeah, we of course you know get rid of the you know, the presuppositions or kind of words as and or he or she or whatever. But in fact, in semantic analysis, every word is a concept. But actually, it's not that they're identical, because we not simply look at further analysis how people would name, like in simple content analysis. Yeah. But we also look at how the concepts are related to each other, in which context they appear, how they are neighboring to other concepts. And in this way, the semantic analysis is more kind of deep and complicated than that.
Which we didn't show here.
Okay, but how you established that there was a connection between the object, paella pan, and the concept paella?
because we made a huge list of relations where first, to have this relation, we first either in photo elicitation asked about the picture where the object was, and the person would name it and also tell some story about it or some comment. That was one possibility for relation. Another is then during an excursion or some other interaction, one of the artists or several artists would speak about the object, pointing to the object or using it, or it could be also an interaction not induced by us as researchers, a natural one where the artist would use objects and again talk about them. So it's always this observed connection between the usage of the thing and the comment.
Nothing to
add.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question regarding the languages which you used in interviews and in which languages the text you were analyzed. I mean, as far as I understood, it was all conducted in the native languages of like German, Spanish, Russian.
Exactly.
And then you translated it into English, right?
Yep. Yeah. But actually there were some exceptions in the first wave. For example, in Germany we would only use German to make interviews and also to analyze the text that artists would produce otherwise. But we at some point decided that it would be acceptable to do photo elicitations in English, which the artists could do and we could do. It was simpler because not so many German-speaking researchers were there in the field. But now we understood that it makes some additional complications because it's very difficult then to combine the networks of the semantic networks and to the ways the people would conceptualize objects, the objects, concepts, links. And now we decided to make everything in the language of origin of the artist. So for the second wave, for example, in Germany, we did everything in German. Yeah, that's translated for more convenience and for comparability for the stages.
And then it was translated by the researchers themselves. I mean,
sometimes we are lacking the competences, and then we also use some assistance from the people who are good in languages. But what we did is we always involved the researchers who were there in the field to check the final lists, which are huge. Like, for example, for shared conceptualizations, it's over 800 concepts, but we still have to look through them and check whether the translation is acceptable, because many translations are situationally related. Actually, if we translate, if there are several possibilities to translate, we write them via slash, but sometimes it doesn't help. A wonderful example, we had volunteers who would be translating the concepts we got in the field when working with Russian communities. And one of the central shared concepts would be mucha. Mucha, to explain to you, Ignacio, and for some of you guys, is the informal name of the higher school where artists get their education. Muchinskoye училище, right? Muchina is a famous artist. After her, the school used to be called. Of course, the poor volunteer translates it as a fly. And then we suddenly get a fly as a central concept of the map. That's just scary. Or, что там с гоблином-то было? There was some other, yeah, there was also the short name of one of the artists, Alexei, Lyosha. But when it is split by the program, the computer program, it turns into Lesh. And the volunteer interprets it as Leshi, and then suddenly at the map I have the translation of wood of forest goblin. And I had to think a bit before I understood where this wooden goblin came from. So you see, you have to be very, very attentive with that, because otherwise you get the mistakes.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe two legal questions. The first one concerns: have you write down the objects that they mentioned, but which haven't been in the studio just like they maybe said about the cars, about and so on?
No, that was our intended limitation. We only wanted objects that were part of the shared spaces. Otherwise, it would have run the risk of being absolutely limited.
And the second one concerns the question, it continues Ignacio's, about sharing and emotional attachment. How did you get that?
Well, with sharing it's very simple. The person, two or more persons had to be either registered as using an object or saying that they would use them. So it's either the observation or the story of the person that he or she does use that. As to the emotional attachment, that's actually the result of the sociometric questionnaire. It's a very formalized thing where you have the list of artists and then the three questions. Whom out of the artistic group do you speak once a week and more? Whom of the artists do you collaborate once in a week and more? And finally, during the last 6 months, and finally, whom of the artists do you feel emotionally attached to? And they would mark the ones that they would feel fit the questions, and then we would also verify the question, the results, because some of the links would be asymmetrical, which means that one of the artists would choose another as a speaking partner, but the other guy would not. Then it's either through the extra questioning the artist or via looking at other materials of ours as observations, whether they do talk to each other according to our observations.
First of all, it's by showing them the diagram and asking if it really looks like something.
Like true. Like true, yeah. But in some cases the verification didn't work. In Fries, the artists would refuse to do that. They didn't want to see it. They decided that it might spoil the relations within the group. Then we had to verify by
even if they themselves
were excluded
and try to just comment on.
Yeah, and in this case we had to verify by looking at other materials of ours, like observations, interviews, because we look at how often they would refer to each other, interviews, as speaking partners or collaborators, or how often we would see them speaking to each other or collaborating and stuff.
Any other questions, please?
Just a short question. Can you guess how you establish distance between people? It's from sociometric and between concepts from just but what about objects? How do you see the objects are linked?
Well, that's a good question. We also thought about that quite often, and we looked through the literature and from different sources, especially from ethnographic inquiries of materiality, we actually ended up with two basic possibilities. It's either the collocation, that are the things are regularly, continuously kept together, or it's a functional relation, that they are used together in the framework of the same process. Again, those two types of things were established either as a result of observation or as a result of people speaking about those things as functionally connected or collocated, which we asked during the photo elicitations and excursions.
So we tried to triangulate from the different sources.